The Red Lodge by H.R. Wakefield. I am writing this from an imperative sense of duty, for I consider the Red Lodge is a foul death trap, and utterly unfit to be a human habitation. It has its own proper denizens, and because I know its owner to be an unspeakable blackguard, to allow it to be so used for his financial advantage. He knows the perils of the place perfectly well. I wrote to him of our experiences, and he didn't even acknowledge the letter, and 2 days ago I saw the ghastly pest house advertised in Country Life. So anyone who rents the Red Lodge in future will receive a copy of this document, as well as some uncomfortable words from Sir William, and that scoundrel Wilkes can take what action he pleases. I certainly didn't carry any prejudice against the place down to it with me. I had been too busy to look over it myself, but my wife reported extremely favourably. I take her word for most things, and I could tell by the photographs that it was a magnificent specimen of the medium-sized Queen Anne house, just the ideal thing for me. Mary said the garden was perfect, and there was a river at the bottom of it for Tim. I had been longing for a holiday, and was in the highest spirits as I travelled down. I have not been in the highest spirits since. My first vague, faint uncertainty came to me so soon as I had crossed the threshold. I am a painter by profession, and therefore sharply responsive to colour tone. Well, it was a brilliant fine day. The hall of the Red Lodge was fully lighted, yet it seemed a shade off the key, as it were, as though I were regarding it through a pair of slightly darkened glasses. Only a painter would have noticed it, I fancy. When Mary came out to greet me, she was not looking as well as I had hoped, or as well as a week in the country should have made her look. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Oh, yes," she replied, but I thought she found it difficult to say so. And then my eye detected a curious little spot of green on the maroon rug in front of the fireplace. I picked it up. It seemed like a patch of river slime. "I suppose Tim brings those in," said Mary. "I found several. Of course he promises he doesn't." And then, for a moment, we were silent, and a very unusual sense of constraint seemed to set a barrier between us. I went out into the garden to smoke a cigarette before lunch, and sat myself down under a very fine mulberry tree. I wondered if, after all, I had been wise to have left it all to Mary. There was nothing wrong with the house, of course, but I am a bit psychic, and I always know the mood or character of a house. One welcomes you with the tall, writhing enthusiasm of a really nice dog, makes you at home and at your ease at once. Others are sullen, watchful, hostile, with things to hide. They make you feel that you have obtruded yourself into some curious affairs which are none of your business. I had never encountered so hostile, aloof, and secretive a living place as the Red Lodge seemed when I entered it at first. Well, it couldn't be helped, though it was disappointing. And there was Tim, coming back from his walk, and the luncheon gong. My son seemed a little subdued and thoughtful, though he looked pretty well, and soon we were all chattering away, with those quick changes of key which occur when the respective ages of the conversationalists are 40, 33, and 6½. And after a good bottle of wine and a glass of port, I began to think I had been a morbid ass. I was still so thinking when I began my holiday in the best possible way by going to sleep in an exquisitely comfortable chair under the mulberry tree. But I have slept better. I dozed off, but I had a silly impression of being watched, so that I kept waking up in case there might be someone with his eye on me. I was lying back and could just see a window on the second floor, framed by a gap in the leaves, and on one occasion when I woke rather sharply from one of these dozes, I thought I saw for a moment a face peering down at me, and this face seemed curiously flattened against the pane. Just a carryover from a dream, I concluded. However, I didn't feel like sleeping any more, and began to explore the garden. It was completely walled in, I found, except at the far end, where there was a door leading through to a path, which, running parallel to the right-hand wall, led to the river a few yards away. I noticed on this door several of those patches of green slime for which Tim was supposedly responsible. It was a dark little corner, cut off from the rest of the garden by 2 rowan trees, a cool, silent little place, I thought it. Then it was time for Tim's cricket lesson, which was interrupted by the arrival of some infernal callers, but they were pleasant people as a matter of fact. The local people, I gathered, who owned the manor house, Sir William Prowse and his lady and his daughter. I went for a walk with him after tea. "Who had this house before us?" I asked. "People called Hawker," he replied. "That was 2 years ago." "I wonder the owner doesn't live in it," I said. "It isn't an expensive place to keep up." Sir William paused, as if considering his reply. "I think he dislikes being so near the river. I'm not sorry, for I detest the fellow. By the way, how long have you taken it for?" 3 months, I replied, "till the end of October." "Well, if I can do anything for you, I shall be delighted." "If you're in any trouble, come straight to me." He emphasized the last sentence. I rather wondered what sort of trouble Sir William envisaged for me. Probably he shared the general opinion that artists were quite mad at times, and that when I had one of my lapses I should destroy the piece in some manner. However, I was duly grateful. I was sorry to find Tim didn't like the river. He appeared nervous of it, and I determined to help him overcome his fear, for the fewer terrors one carries through life with one, the better, and they can often be laid by delicate treatment in childhood. Curiously enough, the year before at Brinton, he seemed to have had no fear of the sea. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, at least I think I can say so. After dinner I strolled down to the end of the garden, meaning to go through the door and have a look at the river. Just as I got my hand on the latch, there came a very sharp, furtive whistle. I turned round quickly, but seeing no one, I concluded it had been someone in the lane outside. However, I didn't investigate further, but went back into the house. I woke up the next morning, feeling a shade depressed. My dressing-room smelled stale and bitter, and I flung its windows open. As I did so, my right foot slipped on something. It was one of those small, slimy, green patches. Now, Tim would never come into my dressing-room. An annoying little puzzle. How on earth had that patch? The question kept forcing itself into my mind as I dressed. How could a patch of green slime Dropped from something? From what? I am very fond of my wife. She slaved for me when I was poor, and always kept me happy, comfortable, and faithful, and she gave me my small son Timothy. I must stand between her and patches of green slime. What in hell's name was I talking about? And it was a flamingly fine day, yet all during breakfast my mind was trying to find some sufficient reason for these funny little patches of green slime, and not finding it. After breakfast, I told Tim I would take him out in a boat on the river. "Must I, Daddy?" he said, looking anxiously at me. "No, of course not," I replied, a trifle irritably, "but I believe you'll enjoy it. Should I be a funk if I didn't come?" "No, Tim, but I think you should try it once anyway." "All right," he said. He's a plucky little chap, and did his very best to pretend to be enjoying himself, but I saw it was a failure from the start. Perplexed and upset, I asked his nurse if she knew of any reason for this sudden fear of water. "No, sir," she said. "The first day he ran down to the river just as he used to run down to the sea, but all of a sudden he started crying and ran back to the house. It seemed to me he'd seen something in the water which frightened him." We spent the afternoon motoring round the neighbourhood, and already I found a faint distaste at the idea of returning to the house, and again I had the impression that we were intruding, and that something had been going on during our absence, which our return had interrupted. Mary, pleading a headache, went to bed soon after dinner, and I went to the study to read. Directly I had shut the door, I had again that very unpleasant sensation of being watched. It made the reading of Sidgwick's The Use of Words in Reasoning, an old favourite of mine which requires concentration, a difficult business. Time after time I found myself peeping into dark corners and shifting my position, and there were little sharp sounds, just the oak panelling cracking, I supposed. After a time I became more absorbed in the book and less fidgety, and then I heard a very soft cough just behind me. I felt icy rays pour down and through me, but I would just not look round, and I would go on reading. I was just about to read another passage when my eye was caught by a green patch which suddenly appeared on the floor beside me, and then another and another, following a straight line towards the door. I picked up the nearest one, and it was a bit of soaking slime. I called on all my willpower, for I feared something worse was to come, and it should not materialize, and then no more patches appeared. I got up and walked deliberately, slowly to the door, turned on the light in the middle of the room, and then came back and turned out the reading lamp and went to the dressing-room. I sat down and thought things over. There was something very wrong with this house. I had passed the stage of pretending otherwise, and my inclination was to take my family away from it the following day. But that meant sacrificing £168, and we had nowhere else to go. It was conceivable that these phenomena were perceptible only to me, being half a Highlander. I might be able to stick it out if I were careful and kept my tail up, for apparitions of this sort are partially subjective. One brings something of oneself to their materializations. That is a hard saying, but I believe it to be true. If Mary and Tim and the servants were immune to it, it was up to me to face it and fight this nastiness. As I undressed, I came to the decision that I would decide nothing there and then, and that I would see what happened. I made this decision against my better judgment, I think. In bed, I tried to thrust all this away from me by a conscious effort to change the subject, as it were. And then I suddenly found myself at the end of the garden, attempting desperately to hide myself behind a rowan tree, while my eyes were held relentlessly to face the door. And then it began slowly to open, and something, which was horridly unlike anything I had seen before, passed through it. And I knew I was there, and then my head seemed to burst, and it flamed asunder, splintered and destroyed. And I awoke, trembling, to feel that something in the darkness was poised an inch or two above me, and then, drip, drip, something began falling on my face. Mary was in the bed next to me. I would not scream, but flung the clothes over my head, my eyes streaming with the tears of terror. And so I remained, cowering, until I heard the clock strike 5, and dawn, the ally I longed for, came, and the birds began to sing, and then I slept. I awoke a wreck, and after breakfast, feeling the need to be alone, I pretended I wanted to sketch and went out into the garden. Suddenly, I recalled Sir William's remark about coming to see him if there were any trouble. Not much difficulty in guessing what he had meant now. I'd go and see him about it at once. I wished I knew whether Mary was bothered too. I hesitated to ask her, for if she were not, she was certain to become suspicious and uneasy if I questioned her. And then I discovered that, while my brain had been busy with its thoughts, my hand had also not been idle, but had been occupied in drawing a very singular design on the sketching block. I watched as it went automatically on. Was it a design or a figure of some sort? When had I seen something like it before? My God! In my dream last night! I tore it to pieces, and got up in my agitation, and made my way to the manor house along a path through tall, bowing, stippling grasses hissing slightly in the breeze. My inclination was to run to the station and take the next train to anywhere. Pure, undiluted panic. Of course I had Mary and Tim and the servants to keep from it, but supposing they had no claim on me, should I desert them? No, I should not. Why? Such things aren't done by respectable inhabitants of Great Britain. I reached the manor house to be told that Sir William was up in London for the day, but would return that evening. Would he ring me on his return? Yes, sir. Then, with lagging steps, back to the Red Lodge. I took Mary for a drive in the car after lunch. Anything to get out of that beastly place. Tim didn't come, as he preferred to play in the garden. In the light of what happened, I shall be criticized for leaving him alone with a nurse, but at the time I held the theory that these appearances were in no way malignant, and that it was more than possible that even if Tim did see anything, he wouldn't be frightened, not realizing it was out of the ordinary in any way. After all, nothing that I had seen or heard, at any rate during the daytime, would strike him as unusual. Mary was very silent, and I was beginning to feel sure, from a certain depression and oppression in her manner and appearance, that my trouble was hers. It was on the tip of my tongue to say something, but I resolved to wait until I had heard what Sir William had to say. It was a dark, sombre, and brooding afternoon, and my spirits fell as we turned for home. What a home! We got back at 6, and I had just stopped the engine and helped Mary out, when I heard a scream from the garden. I rushed round to see Tim, his hands to his eyes, staggering across the lawn, the nurse running behind him, and then he screamed again and fell. I carried him into the house and laid him down on a sofa in the drawing-room, and Mary went to him. I took the nurse by the arm and out of the room. She was panting and crying, tears running down a face of chalk. "What happened? What happened?" I asked.
"I don't know what it was, sir, but we had been walking in a lane, and had left the door open. Master Tim was a bit ahead of me, and went through the door first, and then he screamed like that."
"Did you see anything that could have frightened him?"
"No, sir, nothing."
I went back to them. It was no good questioning Tim, and there was nothing coherent to be learned from his hysterical sobbing. He grew calmer presently, and was taken up to bed. Suddenly he turned to Mary and looked at her with eyes of terror.
"The green monkey won't get me, will it, Mummy?"
No, it's all right now," said Mary, and soon after he went to sleep. And then she and I went down to the drawing-room. She was on the border of hysteria herself.
"Oh, Tom, what is the matter with this awful house? I'm terrified. Ever since I've been here, I've been terrified. Do you see things?"
"Yes," I replied. "Oh, I wish I'd known. I didn't want to worry you if you hadn't. Let me tell you what it's been like. On the day we arrived, I saw a man pass ahead of me into my bedroom. Of course, I only thought I had. And then I've heard beastly whisperings, and every time I pass that turn in the corridor, I know there's someone just around the corner. And then, the day before you arrived, I woke suddenly, and something seemed to force me to go to the window. And I crawled out there on hands and knees and peeped through the blind. It was just light enough to see, and suddenly I saw someone running down the lawn, his or her hands outstretched, and there was something ghastly just behind him, and they disappeared behind the trees at the end.
I'm terrified every minute."
"What about the servants?" "Nurse hasn't seen anything, but the others have, I'm certain. And then there are those slimy patches. I think they're the vilest of all. I don't think Tim has been troubled till now, but I'm sure he's been puzzled and uncertain several times." "Well," I said, "it's pretty obvious we must clear out. I'm seeing Sir William about it tomorrow, I hope, and I'm certain enough of what he'll advise. Meanwhile, we mustn't think over where to go. It is a nasty jar, though I don't mean merely the money, now that's bad enough, but the fuss, just when I hoped we were going to be happy and settled. However, it has to be done. It's got to be done. We should be mad after a week of this filth-drenched hole." Just then the telephone bell rang. It was a message to say Sir William would be pleased to see me at 10:30 tomorrow. With the dusk came that sense of being watched, waited for, followed about, plotted against, an atmosphere of quiet, hunting malignancy. A thick mist came up from the river, and as I was changing for dinner, I noticed the lights from the window seemed to project a series of swiftly changing pictures on its grey, crawling screen. The one opposite my window, for example, was unpleasantly suggestive of 3 figures staring in, and seeming to grow nearer and larger. The effect must have been slightly hypnotic, for suddenly I started back, for it was as if they were all about to close in on me. I pulled down the blind and hurried downstairs. During dinner we decided that unless Sir William had something very reassuring to say, we would go back to London 2 days later and stay at a hotel till we could just find somewhere to spend the next 6 weeks. Just before going to bed, we went up to the night nursery to see if Tim was all right. This room was at the top of a short flight of stairs. As these stairs were covered with green slime, and there was a pool of muck just outside the door. We took him down to sleep with us. The permanent occupants of the Red Lodge waited till the light was out, but then I felt them come through, thronging, slipping in one by one, their weapon fear. It seemed to me they were massed for the attack. A yard away, my wife was lying with my son in her arms, so I must fight. I lay back, gripped the sides of the bed, and strove with all my might to hold my assailants back. As the hours went by, I felt myself beginning to get the upper hand, and a sense of exultation came from me. But an hour before dawn they made their greatest effort. I knew that they were willing me to creep on my hands and knees to the window and peep through the blind, and that if I did so, we were doomed. I set my teeth and tightened my grip till I felt racked with agony. The sweat poured from me, and I felt them come crowding round the bed and thrusting their faces into mine, and a voice in my head kept saying insistently, "You must crawl to the window and look through the blind." In my mind's eye I could see myself crawling stealthily across the floor and pulling the blind aside, but who would be staring back at me? Just when I felt my resistance breaking, I heard a sweet, sleepy twitter from a tree outside, and saw the blind touched by a faint suggestion of light, and at once those with whom I had been struggling left me and went their way, and, utterly exhausted, I slept. In the morning I found, somewhat ironically, that Mary had slept better than on any night since she came down. 10:30 found me entering the manor house, a delightful, nondescript old place which started wagging its tail as soon as I entered it. Sir William was awaiting me in the library. "I expected this would happen," he said gravely. "And now, tell me." I gave him a short outline of our experiences. "Yes," he said, "it's always pretty much the same story. Every time that horrible place has been let, I have felt a sense of personal responsibility, and yet I cannot give a proper warning, for the letting of haunted houses is not yet a criminal offence, though it ought to be, and I couldn't afford a libel action, and as a matter of fact, one old couple had the house for 15 years, and were perfectly delighted with it, being troubled in no way. But now, let me tell you what I know of the Red Lodge. I have studied it for 40 years, and regard it as my personal enemy. The local tradition is that the second owner, early in the 18th century, wished to get rid of his wife, and bribed his servants to frighten her to death. Just the sort of ancestor I can imagine that blackguard Wilkes being descended from. What devilries they perpetrated I know not, but she is supposed to have rushed from the house just before dawn one day and drowned herself. Whereupon her husband installed a small harem in the house, but it was a failure, for each of these charmers, one by one, rushed down to the river just before dawn, and finally the husband himself did the same. Of the period between then and 40 years ago I have no record, but the local tradition has it that it was the scene of tragedy after tragedy, and then was shut up for a long time. When I first began to study it, it was occupied by 2 bachelor brothers. One shot himself in the room which I imagine you use as your bedroom, and the other drowned himself in the usual way. I may tell you that the worst room in the house, the one the unfortunate lady is supposed to have occupied, is locked up. You know the one on the 2nd floor. I imagine Wilkes mentioned it to you." "Yes, he did," I replied. "Said he kept important papers there." "Yes, Well, he was forced in self-defense to do so 10 years ago, and since then the death rate has been lower. But in those 40 years, 20 people have taken their lives in the house or in the river, and 6 children have been drowned accidentally. The last case was the Lord Passover's butler. In 1924, he was seen to run down to the river and leap in. He was pulled back out, but had died of shock. The people who took the house 2 years ago left in a week and threatened to bring an action against Wilkes, but they were warned they had no legal case. And I strongly advise you, more than that, I implore you to follow their example, though I can't imagine the financial loss and great inconvenience, for that house is a death trap. I will, I replied. I had forgotten one thing. When my little boy was so badly frightened, he said something about a green monkey. He did, said Sir William sharply. Well, then it is absolutely imperative that you should leave at once. You remember I mentioned the death of certain children. Well, in each case, they have been found drowned in the reeds just at the end of that lane, and the people about here have a firm belief that the green thing, or the green death, it is sometimes referred to as the first and sometimes as the other, is connected with danger to children. Have you ever seen anything yourself? I asked. I go to the infernal place as little as possible, replied Sir William. But when I called on your predecessors, I most distinctly saw someone leaving the drawing-room as we entered it. Otherwise, all I have noted is a certain dream which recurs with curious regularity. I find myself at the end of the lane and watching the river, always in a sort of brassy half-light, and presently something comes floating down the stream. I can see it jerking up and down, and I always feel passionately anxious to see what it may be. At first I think it is a log, but when it gets directly opposite me, it changes its course and comes towards me, and then I see it is a dead body, very decomposed, and when it reaches the bank, it continues to climb up towards me, and then, I am thankful to say, I always awake. Sometimes I have thought that one day I shall not wake, and then on this occasion something will happen to me, but that is probably merely the silly fancy of an old gentleman who has concerned himself with these singular events rather more than is good for his nerves. That is obviously the explanation, I said, and I am extremely grateful to you. We will leave tomorrow, but don't you think we should attempt to devise some means by which other people may be spared this sort of thing, and this brute Wilkes be prevented from letting this house out again? I certainly do, and we will discuss it on some other occasion. And now, go and pack. A very great and charming gentleman, Sir William, I reflected, as I walked back to the Red Lodge. Tim seemed to have recovered excellently well, but I thought it wise to keep him out of the house as much as possible, so while Mary and the maids packed after lunch, I went with him for a walk through the fields. We took our time, and it was only when the sky grew black, and there was a distant rumble of thunder, and a menacing little breeze came from the west, that we turned to come back. We had to hurry, and as we reached the meadow next to the house, there came a ripping flash, and the storm broke. We started to run for the door into the garden, when I tripped over my bootlace, which had become undone, and fell. Tim ran on. I had just tied my lace, and was on my feet again, when I saw something slip through the door. It was green, thin, tall. It seemed to glance back at me, and what should have been its face was a patch of soused slime. And at that moment Tim saw it, screamed, and ran for the river. The figure turned and followed him, and before I could reach him, it hovered over him. Tim screamed again and flung himself in. A moment later I passed through a green and stenching film and dived in after him. I found him writhing in the reeds and brought him back to the bank. I ran with him in my arms to the house, and I shall not forget Mary's face as she saw us through the bedroom window. By 9 o'clock we were all in a hotel room in London, and the Red Lodge an evil, fading memory. I shut the front door when I had packed them all into the car. As I took hold of the knob, I felt a quick and powerful pressure from the other side, and it shut with a crash. The permanent occupants of the Red Lodge were in sole possession once more.